Everett was returning from an exhausting fair when he spotted Thraka, an orc with hungry eyes rescuing a bag of mouldy bread from the trash. He followed her through the shadows of Thornwood Forest to a forgotten barn on his own land. What he saw inside, a desperate mother and two small children, changed his fate forever. The fair at Millbrook was loud and reeked of mud and livestock. Everett moved through the crowd with the slow drag of a man who had been on his feet since before dawn. His coat was stiff from dried sweat, his boots caked with the brown clay of the trail. He had sold 2 calves that morning and traded timber for salt and candles. A fair day. He wasn't looking for anything more than the road home. That was when he saw her. She stood at the edge of the market stalls like a shadow that had wandered too far from the tree line. Tall, green-skinned. Her shoulders were broad but curled inward as if she were trying to make herself smaller. Her clothes were rough-spun wool, patched at every seam, mended so many times the original cloth was barely visible. She moved with her eyes down, her hands close to her sides. Everett slowed without deciding to. She approached the bread stall carefully, keeping to the edge of the crowd. The baker, a round man with a red face and flour across his apron, saw her coming and stiffened. He turned to help another customer first, letting her wait. She waited without complaint. Only her hands moved, reaching into a small cloth pouch at her belt, counting something inside with her fingers. The baker finished with the other customer. He looked at her, the way a man looks at something not worth his time. She pointed at the day-old loaves near the back. She held out her hand with a few small coins in her palm. The baker didn't look at the coins. He grabbed the stale sack without ceremony and hurled it into the waste barrel beside the stand. The dry thud of bread hitting the bottom cut clean through the noise of the crowd. He said something low and sharp, too low to hear from where Everett stood, but clear enough in its shape, and turned his back. The orc woman stood still for a moment, her hand still extended, the coins still in her palm. Then she closed her fingers, put the coins back, crouched beside the barrel, and pulled the bread sack out with both hands. She pressed it against her chest. She didn't look around. She slipped between 2 stalls and disappeared into the mist before Everett had taken 3 steps in her direction. He tried. He pushed through the crowd, reached the edge of Millbrook, and stared into the grey. She was gone. The cold crept under his collar. Around him, the fair continued its noise. None of it reached him. What reached him was that sound. Dry bread hitting the bottom of a wooden barrel, the flat, dull finality of it. The way she had taken it back without anger, without shame, with just that single moment of stillness before she moved. He stood there longer than he should have. Then he started walking home. The road back wound through the lower edge of Thornwood, where the old oaks grew so close that the light came through in thin grey strips. Evening was pressing in fast. He had half a mile left when he saw movement in the tree line to his right. The green of her skin caught the last pale light between the branches. Just a shape, just a glimpse. But it was her. She was heading toward the far corner of his property. There was nothing out there worth going to. Just the old stone barn he hadn't used in months, forgotten since the autumn. He stopped walking. She didn't see him. She moved with the careful quiet of someone who had learned that being noticed meant danger. Everett watched until she disappeared between the trees. He thought about his house, the fire he had left banked, the stew on the hook. How tired he was. Then, without deciding to, he stepped off the road and followed her into the trees. He kept back, far enough that a snapping twig wouldn't carry to her, close enough to track her shape between the oaks. She walked without hesitation, which meant she had made this walk before. She knew where the roots were, where the ground went soft near the creek bend. This was not a path she had found tonight. That thought settled into his chest and stayed there. She crossed the shallow fork of the Tescan River on the flat stepping stones, her balance easy and sure, the bread sack held up against her chest to keep it dry. Everett crossed behind her, cold water soaking through his boot leather, biting at his ankle. He didn't slow. The old barn appeared through the trees. sudden and heavy, built from dark fieldstone 2 generations before Everett's time. The roof still held, mostly. The door was warped and hung at an angle that required a shoulder to force open. He had meant to fix it. He never had. Thraka reached the door and pulled it open with both hands, her back straining against the warp of the wood. She slipped inside. She did not look back. Everett moved to the barn wall and found a gap in the old mortar where 2 stones had shifted apart over the years. He pressed close and looked through. Inside, 2 children huddled in the far corner against a pile of old straw. The older one was a boy of maybe 7, broad-shouldered even at that age, his green skin darker than his mother's. He had his arm locked around the smaller one, a toddler, barely past 2 years. Wrapped in a cloak far too thin for the cold air coming through the gaps in the roof, the little one was trembling, not crying, trembling. The older boy was not crying either. He sat straight-backed, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the door. When Thraka came through, his whole body relaxed by a degree so small it would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. His shoulders dropped half an inch, his jaw unclenched. The relief was so controlled it was more painful than fear would have been. Thraka set the bread sack on the low wooden table at the center of the room. She opened it. Even through the crack in the wall, Everett could see the blue-green patches of mold along the crust. She picked up a piece and knocked it against the table edge, sharp and hollow, dry wood on stone. She broke it apart and dipped the pieces into a clay bowl of rainwater collected from a gap in the roof. She softened the pieces until they were pliable, then crouched in front of the toddler and held out the first piece. The small boy took it with both hands. He didn't make a sound. He ate. The older boy waited until she offered him a piece before taking any. He ate slowly, as if he understood that this was all there would be. Everett stepped back from the wall. He stood in the dark outside the barn and stared at the ground. The rain had started. Light, barely more than a cold mist, and he was soaked through his collar, his hands numb at his sides. He thought about the baker's face, the flat certainty of it, the way a man can look at another living creature and decide, without hesitation, that their hunger does not matter. He thought about those coins she had put back into the pouch unused. He thought about that boy sitting straight with his arm around his little brother, watching the door, holding everything together with nothing but the strength of a 7-year-old's will. He stood there long enough that the rain came down properly, tapping against the stone of the barn wall, long enough to feel the weight of every warm evening he had spent alone in a house with a full larder and a fire that nobody else sat beside. Then he raised his fist and knocked on the barn door. The silence inside was instant and total. Not a breath, not a scrape of boot on stone. They had gone completely still, the practiced stillness of people who had learned that any sound, when discovered, makes things worse. Everett kept his voice low and chose each word carefully. "I know you're in there. This barn is mine. My land, my property. I'm not the law, and I'm not from the village. I'm just the man who owns the field on the other side of these trees." Silence. "I saw you at the fair today, at the bread stall." A long beat of nothing. Then the door pulled inward by 3 inches, and Thraka filled the gap. She had a bone-handled knife in her right hand. Arm raised, elbow out. Not a warning, but a ready position. Her body filled the frame completely, every inch of her angled between Everett and whatever was behind her. Her eyes were sharp and dark and fixed on his face, reading him the way a traveller reads an unfamiliar road. Everett kept both hands visible at his sides, fingers open. He let her look as long as she needed to. "You've been using this barn for a while," he said. Not an accusation, a fact. The candle was already lit when you arrived. The bowl was already there. You left them here. Behind her, the older boy was standing now, both small hands balled at his sides, jaw set in a mirror of his mother's. 7 years old and doing exactly what she was doing, standing between. Everett looked at the boy for a moment, then brought his eyes back to Thraka and kept them there. "I have a house," he said. "Top of the hill. 10 minutes on foot. Fire's been going since this morning. Pot of stew on the iron, salt pork and root vegetables. Half a loaf of real bread, baked 2 days ago. No mold. He let the words land. 2 bedrooms I don't use. Both have beds with heavy wool blankets. The knife didn't move. I'm not asking you to trust me, he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. I'm asking you to feed your children something warm tonight. After that, whatever you decide, whatever direction you walk in the morning, I won't stop you and I won't follow you. The boy behind Thraka made a sound, small and low, the sound a body makes when it has been empty for too long and something warm is described nearby. He hadn't meant to. His jaw tightened immediately after, ashamed of the weakness. Thraka heard it. Her knife hand dropped 2 inches. She looked at Everett for a long time. The rain tapped steadily on the barn roof above them both. He held her gaze, without flinching, without pushing, without moving at all. Her knife hand dropped the rest of the way. "Show me," she said. Her voice was low and rough and careful. Everett turned and walked back through the rain toward the hill. He did not look back to check if she was following. He just walked, steady, slow, unhurried, toward the light he had left burning in the kitchen window. Behind him, 3 pairs of boots moved through the wet grass. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house. Everett had built the fireplace himself, done it wrong the first time and torn it down and started over. The second version drew well and threw heat far into the room. Tonight the iron pot hung above the coals. The smell of salt pork and root vegetables had settled into every corner. Thraka stood just inside the doorway with her knife still in her hand. She checked the corners, the back door, the single window above the wash basin. She noted the exits. Then, only then, she looked at the pot. Everett moved without speaking. He pulled bowls from the shelf and set them on the table. He ladled stew into each, tore the bread into pieces, set mugs of water beside every bowl. He did not look at Thraka while he worked. He sat down at the far end with his own bowl and ate. The older boy was at the table before Thraka moved. He sat down, looked at his mother, and when she gave the smallest nod, he picked up the spoon. He ate fast but without noise, without spilling, without lifting his eyes from the bowl. The discipline of it was the most painful thing Everett had witnessed all evening. A child that age should not know how to eat like that. The small one, still trembling from the cold, sat in Thraka's lap. She held him with one arm and fed him with the other, small spoonfuls at a time, waiting between each one to make sure his body kept it down. He ate with his eyes half closed, his head tilting slowly toward sleep with every swallow. Everett ate his own stew and said nothing. After a time, the older boy looked up from his bowl. "You own all of this?" he asked. Still careful, still measuring, but underneath it, the hollow shape of where hope had once lived, testing whether it was safe to return. "I do," Everett said. The boy looked around the room, the fireplace, the shelves, the iron pot, the rug on the floor, worn at the center, but whole. "By yourself?" he asked. "By myself," Everett said. The boy thought about that. He tore off a piece of bread and went back to his stew, chewing slowly, thinking. Thraka had not spoken since the barn. She sat with the posture of someone who had never fully relaxed in a room with a stranger, back straight, weight slightly forward, ready to move. She watched Everett the way she had watched him at the door, steady, measuring, filing everything away. He did not push for conversation. He let the warmth of the room do what warmth does. When the small one was asleep against Thraka's shoulder and the older boy's eyes were growing heavy despite his efforts to keep them open, Everett pushed back his chair and stood. He walked to the hallway. "2 rooms down the hall," he said. "Both have beds, heavy blankets. The cold won't get through tonight." He looked at Thraka. "I'll be upstairs. You'll hear me if I move." He said it plainly, not as a comfort, but as information, so she'd know exactly what to expect. He turned toward the stairs. "Why?" Her voice stopped him at the foot of the staircase. Not quite a question, the frame of one. the shape a question makes before it is finished being asked. Everett stood with his hand on the newel post. He thought about it honestly. He didn't reach for the kind answer or the noble one. He reached for the true one, because the bread hit the bottom of that barrel, he said, and nobody did anything. He went upstairs. Below, in the dark hallway, Thraka stood for a long time. The sleeping child was warm and heavy against her shoulder. From the kitchen came the low pop and settle of the fire burning down. From outside came the rain, steady and close. She walked to the rooms. The older boy followed. One hand hooked in the back of her coat. Neither of them made a sound. Everett woke before dawn. He lay still for a moment, listening. The house had a different sound now, a texture to the silence that had not been there the night before. The creak of a mattress in the room below, the particular quiet of a space that has people breathing in it. He had lived alone for 3 years. He had not realized until now how a house sounds when it is empty. He dressed without lighting a lamp and went downstairs. He stoked the fire, added 2 logs, hung the kettle. Grey light came through the kitchen window before the water boiled. Rain still, softer now, more mist than rain. The older boy appeared first in the kitchen doorway. He had slept in his clothes and his boots, the way a person sleeps when they are not sure if they will need to run. He stopped at the edge of the room and studied Everett with the same careful attention as the night before. "Sit down," Everett said. He kept his voice ordinary. No particular warmth, no particular edge. Just the voice of a man talking to someone in his kitchen in the morning. "Porridge in a few minutes." The boy crossed the room and sat. He put both hands flat on the table and waited. Thraka came in a minute later with the toddler on her hip, the small one blinking and slow. She noted what had changed since the night before, where everything was. She sat down without being asked. Everett set bowls of porridge on the table. He added dried fruit from a crock on the shelf. He sat down, and for a while the only sounds were spoons against clay and the fire finding its pace. Then he folded his hands on the table. "I've got 40 acres, he said. He was looking at the grain of the wood, not at either of them, talking plainly, not performing. "Most of it grazing land for the cattle. The herd takes most of my days. I've got a kitchen garden that's gone to weeds because I can't be in 2 places at once. A fence line on the north side that needs reposting before the wet season, and a cellar that needs restocking before the roads close." He looked up. "I'm offering work. Real work, shared fairly. A roof, food, a wage when the season allows. You'd have the downstairs rooms. I'd have upstairs. The arrangement lasts as long as it suits both of us." Thraka looked at him across the table. She had the quality of someone who hears what isn't being said, the weight of what is left out, the space around words. "The people in Millbrook," she said, "they know this land. They know it's mine," Everett said. "That's enough." She was quiet for a moment. The toddler grabbed a piece of dried fruit from the edge of her bowl with both hands and crammed it into his mouth. Then Thraka reached across the table and turned her hand palm up on the wood. Not quite the shape of a handshake, but something in that direction. An orc gesture. Everett had seen it once before, at the edge of the Greywood territories, watching 2 traders close a deal. It meant something like, "I put what I have into this." He placed his hand in hers. Her grip was dry and certain and strong. She held for 2 seconds and let go. Across the table, the older boy, Hark, Everett would learn his name that morning over the rest of breakfast, and the small one was Vaughan, let out a slow, quiet breath, as if he had been holding it for a very long time. The first weeks were careful ones. Thraka worked without being asked twice. She moved through the property with economy. No wasted motion, no wasted time. She saw what needed doing and did it in the order that made the most sense. He came back from the lower pasture one afternoon to find the north fence posts set in fresh mortar. 3 sections of rotten rail replaced with timber. She'd split herself. Work he'd been planning for a month. He stopped at the fence and looked at it. Then he went and found something else to do. After the first week, he stopped explaining tasks. After the second, he started leaving notes. She stopped reading the notes after the third week and just worked. Hark shadowed Everett through the mornings, not asking for permission, just appearing nearby and watching. The boy had a quick mind and an eye for detail. He noticed the gate hinge wearing thin. He noticed the shallow ford in the creek that would save 20 minutes on the cattle run. He never made a point of these things, just mentioned them in passing without emphasis. Everett started paying attention to what Hark mentioned. Vaughan was simpler. He was 2 years old, and the world was primarily something to explore with his hands. Everett had built a small pen at the edge of the kitchen garden, within sight of whoever was working nearby, and Vaughan spent his mornings there moving dirt from one location to another with great seriousness. The routine settled. The days found their shape. 3 weeks in, Everett went to Millbrook for supplies. At the grain store, the man behind the counter, Carver, a heavy-set fellow who had opinions about everything and rarely had them challenged, looked up from his ledger and said he'd heard there was an orc woman out on Everett's farm. Said people were talking, said it wasn't right. Everett paid for his oats, picked up the sack, and walked out without giving Carver the argument he was looking for. On the ride home, he thought about what it meant that the talk had started, not the content. The content was predictable. What mattered was that it would grow, and that sooner or later it would take a shape that walked up to his gate. He told Thraka that evening while she sharpened tools by lamplight at the work table. She kept sharpening, long, even strokes. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you so you're not surprised," he said. "I'm never surprised," she said. He watched her work. "If anyone comes to this property, they answer to me. The land is recorded. Anyone who causes trouble here has a legal problem." She set the tool down and looked at him directly. That level, measuring look. "You can't protect against all of it," she said. "I know that," he said. "I'm not trying to protect against all of it. I'm telling you I'll handle what I can." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up the next tool and went back to sharpening. Outside, the wind moved through the pines at the edge of Thornwood. The lamp threw long shadows across the work table. The silence between them was different from the silence of the first days. Less a wall, more a room. The trouble came on a Thursday, just before the first hard frost. It had been building for weeks. Everett had felt it each time he went to Millbrook, in the way conversations quieted when he approached, in the way certain men looked at him and then looked away. He had been waiting for the shape of it to arrive. 3 men rode up the south road before midday. Carver was among them, sitting his horse with the posture of a man who believed he was doing something necessary. The 2 others were brothers from the mill. Big men, broad through the shoulder, the kind of men brought along to make a number rather than an argument. Everett was in the barn when he heard the horses. He came out with a hammer in his hand, not as a threat. Just because he'd been working and hadn't thought to set it down, he walked to the gate and stopped there. He did not open it. Carver started talking before his horse fully stopped. The argument was the one Everett had been waiting for. An orc on human land, a disruption to the proper order of the county. People were talking. Neighboring farms had heard. What precedent did it set? The words were different from those used in the old border disputes, but the shape underneath was exactly the same fear wearing a different coat. Everett stood at the gate and let them finish. "She works this land," he said, when the silence had held long enough. "She earns her keep. She follows the law." He looked at each man in turn. Carver, then the first brother, then the second. "Same as anyone on this road." Carver leaned forward in the saddle. "There are children in there, half-breed." "Her children," Everett said, "on my land." The word "my" came out flat and final, not raised, not hardened with anger, just placed there, solid as fieldstone. Not a challenge, a door closing. Carver's jaw worked once, twice. He looked at the brothers. Some calculation passed between them. a number coming up short. Then Carver pulled his reins and turned his horse without another word. The brothers followed. They rode down the road and did not look back. Everett stood at the gate until the sound of hooves faded into the distance. The morning was cold and still. Somewhere in the upper pasture, one of the cattle called once and went quiet. He turned back toward the barn and found Thraka standing at the corner of the building, just back from the line of sight from the road. She had a hand-axe in her grip, held low at her side, blade forward. She had not moved during the entire exchange. "You heard," he said. "All of it," she said. He nodded. He walked past her toward the barn door. She didn't follow immediately. She stood at the corner and looked down the road at the dust the horses had disturbed. It was already settling. In a few minutes there would be no sign they had come at all. Then she lowered the axe and walked into the barn. Everett was at the fence post he'd been working on before the riders came. He set the next nail and drove it home in one clean stroke. Behind him, he heard Thraka set the axe on the workbench, pick up the second hammer, walk to the next post, and brace it with her foot. He didn't turn around. The sound of the second hammer joined the first. After a few minutes, the rhythm of the two of them found its pace, not perfectly matched, but close enough that each stroke filled the gap the other left. At the edge of the field, the first frost was forming on the long grass, white and quiet, spreading in from the margins. Neither of them spoke about what had happened at the gate. Neither of them needed to. The cold months came down hard. Snow arrived in Thornwood in the first week of deep winter, not the tentative early frost, but the real thing, heavy and sustained. It came one night while everyone slept and covered everything by morning. The roads from Millbrook went quiet within a week, then silent. The world contracted to the size of the farm. Everett had wintered alone before and knew the rhythms of it, the shortened days, the work moving indoors, the way a man can go a week without seeing another person and stop noticing. It had been enough. This winter was different. The house had sound in it. Hark's boots on the floor in the early morning, always up first, always had the fire stoked before Everett came downstairs. Vaughan's low babbling as he moved across the kitchen. The particular scrape of Thraka's stool against the stone hearth in the evenings, when she sat to work by firelight, mending clothes, sharpening tools, sometimes just sitting with her hands still and her eyes on the fire. Everett noticed, without intending to, the way she moved around him, careful at first, the careful of someone who has learned that closeness carries risk, but the weeks wore it down slowly, the way water works on stone. She started leaving his tools where she knew he'd need them. He started building the fire up on evenings she stayed late in the barn. Neither of them mentioned these things. They just happened and accumulated and became the texture of the days. Hark noticed. He said nothing, but Everett caught the boy watching them sometimes with that careful attention he brought to everything. The first time their hands touched in a way that was different from accident was over a fence rail in the lower field, both of them reaching to brace the same post at the same moment. She pulled back first. He didn't. For a moment, they both held the rail without moving. Then she looked at him. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. But after that, the space between them in the kitchen was a little smaller. At the work table, their elbows would be close enough to feel warmth. On cold mornings, walking out to check the cattle, their steps fell in the same rhythm without trying. Spring came early that year. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes. The creek ran fast and dark with meltwater. The first green pushed through the mud in the kitchen garden before the last snow had left the upper field. Thraka planted in rows so straight they might have been laid with a string, pausing sometimes to press a seed into the earth with her thumb as if placing something important somewhere it would be remembered. Everett watched her from the fence one morning, a mug going cold in his hand, and understood something he hadn't had the right word for all winter. He went inside and washed his face at the basin and did not put words to it. But that evening, When she came in from the field and sat across from him at the table, he met her eyes and held them a second longer than he used to. She held them back. Vaughan crawled into Everett's lap and fell asleep with his fist against his chin. Everett kept very still, one hand resting on the child's back, feeling the small and certain rise and fall of his breathing. Thraka watched them. She did not look away. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the spring darkness was full of running water. Nobody said anything. Nothing needed to be said. The second summer came in full and generous. The kitchen garden was heavy. Squash and runner beans, thick rows of turnips and beets, herbs Thraka had grown from seeds she'd kept wrapped in cloth since before Everett had ever seen her face. The cattle were healthy. The fence held. The cellar was packed deep enough that the coming winter held no particular fear. Millbrook had not sent anyone to the gate since Carver's visit in the autumn. The talk had not stopped. Everett still heard it in sidelong comments at the grain store. But talk, he had come to understand, is what happens when people cannot find any other argument. Let them talk. Hark had turned 9 in the spring. He had grown fast and wide, with his mother's broad frame and something in his eyes that was entirely his own, a steadiness that caught people off guard. He spent his mornings with Everett in the upper field and his afternoons with Vaughan, who at 4 years old was talking in full sentences and had decided that any piece of wood he found was an object waiting to be made into something else. The baby had come in the deep of late winter, small and loud and immediately, completely present. He had Thraka's colour at the cheek and jaw, lighter at the hands, and around the eyes something that was Everett's without question. Everett had held him first, while Thraka rested, and the weight of the child had been the most certain thing he had felt in years. They sat together on the porch steps in the long evenings, Hark guiding Vaughan's small hands around a piece of pine, showing him where to push the blade and where to follow the grain, where the wood wanted to go and where it would fight you. Vaughan's brow was furrowed with a concentration that looked like his mother's. Hark was patient with him in a way that had nothing to do with effort. It was simply how he was. Everett sat in the porch chair with Cale against his chest and watched them. Now it was evening. The sun was going long and gold across the pasture, the shadows of the fence posts stretching far into the grass. The smell of the day was still in the air, warm earth, fresh-cut wood, the sweetness rising off the bean vines. Thraka came out of the kitchen and settled into the chair beside him. No tool, no task. She just sat and looked at the boys on the step and let the evening come in around them. Everett shifted Kyle against his chest. The baby stirred without waking, made a small sound like a question, and went back to sleep. On the step, Vaughan held up the piece of wood he'd been working on. He turned it in the fading light with great seriousness. It was rough and lopsided, and not yet resolved into any recognizable form. He announced that it was a horse. Hark studied it. He turned it slightly in his hand, looked at it from the side. "Yes," he said, "that's a horse." Thraka made a sound low in her throat, something between a laugh and an exhale, warm and unguarded, the sound she made when something pleased her more than she intended to show. He looked at her. She looked at him. Below them, Hark glanced back over his shoulder at the two of them, just long enough to see what he saw. Then he turned back to his brother and said something quiet about the angle of the horse's leg. The sun finished its slow descent behind the far hills. The light shifted from gold to amber to the soft grey-blue of early dark. The first stars appeared above the pines, faint and cold and high, the ones that come out before the sky is ready for them. Kyle breathed steadily against Everett's chest. Vaughan leaned his whole weight into Hark's arm and was almost asleep, sitting up, his carved horse gripped in one small fist. The farm was quiet around them. The cattle settled in the lower field, the barn door latched, the kitchen fire banked low. Thraka reached over without looking and rested her hand on the arm of Everett's chair, close enough to feel. He turned his palm up. She set her hand in it. Below the step, Hark said nothing. He just put his arm around Vaughan and let the boy sleep. The dark came in slowly, the way it does at the end of good days, as if it doesn't want to rush what remains. Where a cold stone barn had once held hunger and silence and two children trying not to be found, there was now a lit window and voices and the sound of a family the world had said should not exist, existing quietly in the full and ordinary dark. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.